So yeah, we are talking about the fifth dimension, the cyber battleground, and I have a great panel, and I would love to introduce at first Sandra Joyce. She's the Vice President at Mandiant Intelligence, which is part of Google Cloud. Great to have you, Sandra. Thanks for being here. And then we have Barbara Kluge. She's the Deputy Head of the Department for Cyber and Information Security at our Federal Ministry of Interior. And Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar, she's the Director of the Digital Society Institute at the ESMT Berlin. And so I want to start with the secret I'm going to share with you, because Sandra and we had the chance to talk yesterday. And Sandra has a very special connection to Germany. She's actually fluent in German. She has at most fluent. And she's having a special connection to Baden-Württemberg because she did a school exchange program in near Offenbach.
Near Offenburg.
Offenburg, yeah. Sorry. And she did an internship at Wolfgang Schäuble. So she's an expert on America, and she's also an expert on Germany. So my first question goes to you, and it's about when we talk about cybersecurity, what are the differences between the US and Germany in the perspective on looking at this field?
I think I can answer that very generally, and I'm not so sure I'm an expert in Germany, although I was an expert because I was auf ein Forellenzucht, on a fish farm in the middle of the Black Forest in my year. So as far as I was concerned, everybody walked around in lederhosen, and in Germany, very normal, right? It was a wonderful experience while I was there. But I think if we generalize for a second, because that's really the only way to answer a question like this, but to generalize, I think that the tone when you speak about cybersecurity in the United States is more about national security, defense, militarization. When you speak about cybersecurity in Europe, the tone is more about privacy, regulations, and standards. And both probably are two sides to the same coin, right? Cybersecurity needs both the national defense or the security, let's say, international security component, as well as the privacy component, and balancing the two is really the work of everybody in cybersecurity, especially on the policy side.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think the European perspective brings in Heli, because Heli, you're Estonian, and we know that Estonia is a very digitalized and very resilient country. You have to be after 2007, after the big cyber attack, and you're also in the diplomatic corps in Brussels. So I think looking at the two perspectives, the privacy thing and the defense thing, when you look at it as from a European perspective, what do you think?
Well, it's true that the discourse and narrative in Europe, of course, is about privacy and the more civilian side of cyber, or cybersecurity in terms of cyber safety and cyber resilience. So in Brussels, we always said cyber resilience is the aim that we are working for. But on a national level, I think also many countries would tie it still up with the national security, defense, and more military issues, especially now with the war going on in Europe. And I think Estonia has this kind of unique experience, how we built up the new cyber system after 2007 attacks, that we understood it is not enough if our government resources and government cyber agency and all the other government cyber experts would be, mobilized when the next similar large-scale attack happens. So you need also some broader society. And then we set up something which we call Cyber Defense League, which is the voluntary national organization that consists of experts working in different private sector companies, but in times of crisis or war, they can be mobilized by government, and they would be placed in the command structure of the defense forces and doing, of course, some sort of cyber defense work. So that's the solution of a small country to provide more cyber workforce in times of crisis. I think these kind of innovative solutions are out there that also other countries in Europe could look at.
So, Barbara, you're working at a ministry that is like the one ministry we tend to look at when it comes to cybersecurity in Germany. And we have a lot of things to do. And the minister has an agenda for cybersecurity, and you hear what Heli said, what Sandra said. What are the things you want to integrate into the German strategy for the next years?
Well, in Germany, we have a big emphasis on the preventive part of cybersecurity, especially the resilience. Cyber resilience is one of our major issues. The protection of critical infrastructure is more than ever in our conscience. I think that the war going on in Ukraine created more awareness for cyber topics, and therefore more people, normal people, not dealing with cybersecurity on a day-to-day basis or even professionally, tend to take care of their own data, to protect their data, to protect their systems, and that's a very important thing. We need to protect especially critical infrastructure, but we also need to raise awareness of everybody in order to strengthen the stability of IT systems.
You mentioned some things I want to follow up on. I think cyber resilience is a big topic. We will talk about it later because there's an European act coming up in this regard. But let's talk about critical infrastructure. We had, I'm sure all of you heard, we had this Lufthansa thing going on today, and of course every one of us was like, it's a cyber attack. And cyber is so present at the moment, but shouldn't we be careful about this, Sandra, that it's not always like cyber is the first thing we think of, so it's kind of an alarm status we have here?
I think we've reached a point in our society where we are very sensitive to it, and so if there is an IT problem, we assume we're under attack. I think the thing that it reminds me of is after 9/11. Every car backfiring, somebody thought it was a terrorist attack, right? So we have to just be very sober when we go into these things and understand that not only when there is an incident of some kind, it can take time before we actually know what the truth is. And many of the breaches that we respond to at Mandiant, the first thought you have about what is going on often is incorrect. Right, because you have to gather more information. You don't know the attribution of the threat actor. You don't know necessarily the scope and scale of what has happened. And why is that important is when we create legislation, for example, or policies around reporting requirements, we need to keep that in mind, that new information is not necessarily accurate information. And it will take time in different stages of an incident where you will need to have diligence and patience to know, you might not have anything worth saying in the first 24 hours. Now, the downside is sometimes the threat actors, for example, if it's a ransomware attack, what we have seen is sometimes they will go public for you, and then you have a communication question that you need to be answering.
But I'm sure you all have heard it as well. It was a bulldozer that caused this outtake, and it shows us again the resilience of critical infrastructure in Germany. Barbara, what is your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, Lufthansa is not a critical infrastructure. Due to our current legal situation, it's not. It's going to be after NIS2, but right now it's not. But it clearly shows how dependent we are on IT, and also that we need to strengthen resilience, not only with respect to cyber attacks, but also in a very physical way. There's a legal initiative going on, the so-called Kritisdachgesetz, and it tackles the whole package. It's not only about cybersecurity, but also about physical safety and security.
And I think the reason why we are all, I think it was one guess I read online was, well, 1 day before or 2 days before my Munich cybersecurity conference, Lufthansa is not flying. Well, it can't be a coincidence. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about that, of course. The war is going on almost for a year now, and I think there is the moment where we can look into the last year and say, what are the learnings we saw when it comes to the operations Russia especially is conducting in cyberspace? Heli, what would you say, what are learnings so far?
We have seen extraordinary solidarity of the Western cyber community to help Ukraine. And I think this public-private partnership, this ad hoc international coalition, which was formed very quickly after the first hours of the war, or even day before, with the biggest Viper attack against the Ukrainian transport systems. I think this shows the next level of maturity amongst our cyber community, but also the way how we are able to mobilize our best capabilities on the Western side. I think we could be advised to put together some lessons learned from very successful mitigation of some of the very dangerous cyber attacks in Ukraine, so that we, European countries ourselves, could be also better prepared in case of this kind of operations will hit us maybe at some point.
Sandra, for someone who's monitoring threat actors as a business, what are your take on the things we learned so far?
Yeah, we learned quite a bit, actually. One of them is in our incident response work, what we were able to discern was that many of the wipers that were launched from Russian threat actors actually took advantage of persistence in the network that had been there for years. What I mean by that is they were already persistent in the networks and then launched their attacks from there. We have to be very vigilant about compromise assessments and the current state of the security of our networks. Some other lessons that we've seen is Russia's willingness to use hacktivists either directly or indirectly to put out some of their activities. So one example is HackNet, KillNet. Those are two sort of hacker collectives. What we witnessed was a Russian APT group exfiltrating data from one Ukrainian entity, and within 24 hours, we were seeing it pop up in a HackNet Telegram channel. That happened 4 times. So we don't know if it's a GRU operator on keyboard or just a relationship, a loose collaboration, but certainly there is a connection that we're not entirely clear on. But more tactically, let's say on the battlefield, and I'll wrap with this one, we learned that as Russian forces were advancing on the ground, they would capture infrastructure along the way. And what that taught us was it is very likely that what we'll see in sort of these kinetic campaigns is embedded cyber action teams that are actually with the land forces going and taking over teams, because what we were seeing was local access. So that's an interesting takeaway for us.
So, and there was especially when the war started, there was a lot of talk about that Germany will also become a target, could become a target. And I think it was kind of scary for a lot of people because it was a lot of scenarios going on there. So, Barbara, what was your take on that as a government institution?
Well, of course, the situation is critical, but we have not yet been immediate target of an attack. We know that this could happen anytime, so we have to tackle that. We have to raise our resilience. We have to take care that all relevant players closely cooperate, that they exchange information. We have to strengthen the cyber architecture, and also the BSI, the Federal Office for Information Security. They play a key role within this architecture. And of course, international cooperation is key, because there's no border in cyberspace, so we have to cooperate internationally and closely. That's what we do, first of all, of course, within Europe, but also with the US and other key players worldwide.
So maybe a question for all 3 of you. You can decide who wants to answer, or if you want to answer. But there are 2 narratives I'm hearing. The one is the reason why we are not attacked or there was no big incidents in Germany or in Europe, for example, is because Russia is so distracted with protecting itself and also launching the things on Ukraine. The other thing is that deterrence is actually working. So what do you think is more appropriate, or is it both, or is there something in the middle? I'm really eager to understand.
Well, if you ask the operational cyber people, then they would say that they have seen attacks increasing also towards the European targets. But as most of our European countries are quite resilient and we have capabilities to deal with relatively serious attacks in most of European countries quite well already now. So that's why many of these attacks did not reach the headlines. Also, of course, Russians are not that coordinated and so prepared maybe, and when some of the attacks on the ground in Ukraine were happening, they were coordinated with the military or battlefield activities, but sometimes they were not so coordinated. It's also that the other side is not that coordinated. So I think the truth is in both narratives.
Well, I think it's probably helpful for us to just really define our terms. So attacks, if we think about classic attacks of disruption or destruction, maybe those are not as present. However, just last week, there was a barrage of spear phishing emails against diplomatic organizations across Europe on Friday, just this Friday, from a Russian APT group that is involved with these things. So I think what we're seeing is we're seeing a constant attempt or a constant signaling that Russia is trying to maintain access or obtain and maintain access for strategic optionality. In the event that they do decide to do something destructive or disruptive, what they're doing now is trying to gain that access. Because what we learned, as I said, in Ukraine is that they had maintained persistence for years, in some cases since 2012. Right, so I think that that's a way to look at it as well.
No, actually, everything said, I think it's both sides, as Heli just stated, and we have to stay alert and just have a close look at the analysis and the information we have, and just make sure that the cooperation works, and also to take care of our resilience. Then we're rather good prepared. There's no guarantee, but anyway, we should do what we can.
So I think what the Ukraine war taught us, it's a thesis, you can say it's wrong, is that there are a big connection now between, like, you can't say, is it a cyber criminal or is it a state-sponsored group? We saw that in the attack of Montenegro, for example, where we weren't sure, is it a Russian group? Is it state-sponsored? Is it just like, what's the connection? And we also see, like, today's news, an Israeli company is selling disinformation campaigns to the highest bidder to harm democracy. And it's just not because of a motive, like a classic criminal motive, it's just like a business. So how should we think when it comes to persecution and also to public-private partnerships when we look at the cyberspace? What are the key takeaways we should think of?
That's a very big question. There's so many components to it. And you're right, the lines are blurring between cybercrime and nation-state activity. In fact, we now have seen examples from the SVR, GRU, and the FSB that are actually going into criminal undergrounds to gain third-party access to networks. And this used to be something where, from the defender's point of view, we always like to say, well, this is cybercrime, this is nation-state activity, because that's the way that we organically organize. So in our bureaucracies, in our systems, in our departments and organizations, we like things to be nice and clean because there has to be a boss, there's a staff, and we are organized that way. And cybercriminals and nation-state actors, they don't care about any of that. In fact, they're counting on us having as many layers and borders between that we possibly can have. So if your question is, how should we be looking at this? if we would really benefit from looking at cybersecurity and the landscape with the lens of a threat actor. They're looking for as much division as possible. They're looking for vulnerabilities, vulnerable systems. They're looking for places where somebody says, I only will work with an American company or a German company, or I will only talk to a government about this. I will not share information with a commercial company about cyber threats. Those who benefit from that are the threat actors, because it is only when we're all working together and have a full picture of what's going on that we can start writing detections and defending together.
Barbara, you're like nodding.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. That's it. We have those blurred lines. The categories we were working with up to now, they don't work any longer. We have to stop thinking and working in those categories. You never know whether it's state-sponsored or criminal, or sometimes it's only an accident, as we heard today. So we need to stop thinking in categories and start considering the whole thing as a unique phenomenon. And cooperating, I think, is the key to everything.
I know there's a best practice, for example, from the United States. It's the Counter-Ransomware Initiative, which was invented by President Biden, and Germany is part of it. I think it has the workforce for diplomacy. Mm-hmm. There's one on counter-attacks, which is led by Australia, but this is one initiative. Is there something coming up in Germany, an idea to foster the cooperation between states and the private sector?
We already have a very close cooperation with the private sector, not only in the protection of critical infrastructure, and we have to move on in that field. It's actually a matter of capacity. We have to take one step after the other, but there's a lot of work that has still to be done. So we took first steps. We also address smaller and medium companies, not only the big operators of critical infrastructure, the bigger entities, and there needs to be a closer cooperation also with the economic sector, of course.
Heli, you want to add something?
I think it was all said, and I think I could maybe just add that we have to also be innovative in our response, because we as a hierarchy, as a government or as a company or any Western entity, we are not blurring those lines ourselves so easily. So it makes our response much more difficult, this asymmetric threat with blurred lines. So,
what would be a solution? What would be your wish?
I think what could work, and it has worked, is that the incident responders are very much linked up with different, either the sectoral or governmental, what is called CERTs in cyber world, which is the emergency response teams of the cyber incidents, so that they will feed all this information quite quickly into the system for the others and give the warning that, well, I saw this weird attack this morning. Well, be careful, you can be hit with this like in a few hours too. And it sometimes I think you can have the sectoral information sharing centers, like in the US they have ISACs. In Europe it's not so easy because we have so many problems why we cannot share information, because there's, another ministry cannot talk to another ministry, and one agency wants to sit on the information and can talk to another one, and then there are governmental levels and there are the private sector levels. I think somehow eventually it happens, but in Europe we certainly have room for development on our response and information sharing side.
Room for development. I have a lot of questions, but I want to also invite the audience on asking questions. I would love you to stand up, and if you could say your name and your institution you're working for or where you're from, that would be awesome. So here is a question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Maximilian Ziegler. I'm an intern at ECFR, a European Council on Foreign Relations. And my question would be, how do we deal with the fact that a lot of these zero-day exploits that were hoarded by Western governments over the past years are now being used in many of these attacks? And how do we most credibly respond to the fact if we look at how, for example, the attack in 2016 on Ukraine, the Indestroyer attack was based partly off of Stuxnet, which was used in Iran. And how does one even begin to work with, other partners across the globe when a large part of the fault is with Western governments? And what trajectory is this heading towards? Thank you.
You have a wish for someone to answer it, or is it for everyone?
Perhaps for Sandra or for everyone, whoever might feel.
Sandra, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I can't speak to, what the government and Western governments are or not hoarding. I suppose they would probably not tell anybody if they were. But I think that, something very interesting that I pulled out from your comment and question was when a cyber tool or malware or weapon is released in the wild and then taken and used by others. I mean, that's something that has happened several times in the last few years. This sort of wormable exploits that are released because of sometimes unintentionally is something that I think is definitely worth looking at. One of the biggest and most dangerous of these was Triton. I believe it was 17 or I think it was 17, where the Research Institute of Chemistry and Mechanics outside of Moscow was running experiments on and trying to dabble with the safety systems of an oil and gas plant in the Middle East, causing that system to shut down. Some magazines called it the most murderous malware they'd ever seen. And the question then becomes, why would that type of research be occurring? And in the case of reckless, deployment of that, the effects are maddening if you think of it. NotPetya was another, you could say, was an attempt to only target, a tax system in Ukraine, then is released probably unintentionally on the rest of the world. WannaCry from North Korea, same thing. There's a lot of evidence that it was released prematurely, and then that caused the disruption to hospitals and other organizations around the world. So I think the problem is multifaceted. The problem of sort of recklessness in general around the development of cyber tools is something we certainly need to be paying attention to.
Thank you. Another question. Then I would like to follow up with this question. The discussion about 0 days is ongoing, and it's if you look at it from a very neutral perspective, it's some government institution will say we need that for criminal investigations. The other one would say, well, we need to close that. Can we ever fix this? Can we end this discussion? Is there any possibility? Maybe Heli and Barbara, what do you think?
The 0 days are there until we have this kind of software what we have. And there are speculations, of course, that if AI starts producing software, and we will have the software and hardware which is more stable and secure, then we maybe have less 0 days. And now we have the Cyber Resilience Act by the European Union that also would ask both software and hardware to become more resilient, more tested. So possibly this will also reduce the overall number of vulnerabilities and 0 days. But I think with the current technological development, it's not possible to eliminate 0 days entirely.
Well, we have a very lively ongoing discussion within Germany with respect to 0 days and the so-called vulnerability equity process. The discussion is still going on. I can't tell in what direction it will go on and where the result will be, but I think we will never be in a position that there are no 0 days. And as a matter of fact, there are also lots of vulnerabilities that exist for quite a long time and are not patched, either by the people responsible for a program or a device, or that the users are very well, unconscious. They don't do updates. This is something we also have to tackle. People are responsible for their IT and for their devices, and they should also install patches as soon as they're available. This is also a very important thing. And the European Union tackles that with the Cyber Resilience Act. And we also have an initiative in Germany, already existing initiative, that's the cyber security, how is it called? Cybersicherheitskennzeichen, cybersecurity signal, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. It's something to raise awareness and to make people aware of the fact that buying safe and secure devices is a value as such, and that they should just take care of their cyber hygiene.
Let's talk about awareness, which is, of course, the other side of, like, we can talk about what should the state do, but it's also like what should companies do. And Sandra, when you look at the United States, how is awareness, especially when we talk about like medium-sized companies, how would you assume that?
I think sometimes if we are part of the cybersecurity community, we think things are very obvious and that how could somebody not know about the threats? But if you go into the rest of the United States, I think that there's still maybe an awareness that there is a problem, but not necessarily, especially in small, medium businesses, real solutions for the sort of non-enterprise entities, right now. They tend to also be the deliverers of critical services. Often they're the ones that tend to interact face-to-face with people as well. So they are probably an overlooked segment of the cybersecurity problem, because most of the time we are focused on the most visible, the most enterprise, government, that kind of thing.
We talked about that earlier, actually, because there is a regulation coming up, and it's actually it's an order that has to be translated into national law in Germany and all across the European member state. It's called the NIS2 directive, which will, broaden the safe security zone of companies, and it will affect a lot of medium or small and medium-sized companies, actually. Do they know that, Barbara?
No, I'm not so sure. They could, and we did all we could to inform, especially the branch organizations, so they get in touch with their members. But NIS2 has a so-called size cap rules that leads to a situation where in Germany from now 4,500 entities that are considered critical infrastructures, in the future we will have 25,000. So it's also a matter of capacity in the market. I guess that especially the smaller companies sometimes don't even know where the data is hosted, let alone what cybersecurity measures are taken. So there's a lot of work to be done. And apart from that, I mean, even if a smaller company is not a critical infrastructure and doesn't fall under NIS2, people should be aware that they have to take care of their data, because ransomware attacks have grown immensely, and they are threatening for the existence of smaller companies. So this is a big field. We tackle that. We have respective initiatives, especially in the BSI, an information sharing portal, for example, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
But Heli, isn't the problem, and Barbara mentioned it, that there is also a lack of talent, and it's not only a European problem, it's also an American problem. So can you blame the companies that need to keep up with a lot of regulation and now like implement a lot of new regulation that require talent that isn't there?
Yeah, you are very much right. The small companies have to comply with the GDPR. They have to comply with For instance, the Cyber Resilience Act, if they produce some hardware or software. And of course, now they have to comply with the NIS2. So at some point, I can imagine the situation where the compliance officer looks at the different fines and would pick, okay, we comply today with this because the fine is smaller if we pay, the GDPR fine instead of the, I don't know, the other fine. So I think this is the example of failed regulation. If instead of better security, the companies then resort to compliance only, and the model is to avoid paying fines, not to build better security. So it's very difficult to make a security regulation work, I think, and possibly we still have to work on this front in Europe.
Can I address that? I've been giving the cyber workforce issue a lot of thought, and I think that if you spoke to people who are doing the work of cybersecurity, many of them, we've done so much to invest in this technology or that technology to protect the perimeter, endpoint, email. We do all of the things there. What we don't invest in is the workflow of the cybersecurity analyst or researcher or the SOC analyst. And if you talk to them, they are still doing things like copy pasting from here to an Excel spreadsheet so they can import a bunch of things for detections. They still have a very clunky day-to-day job. In fact, I've heard that a lot of them love the mission, but they hate their job because it is so tedious. They're manually looking at alerts. They need solutions that are going to automate a lot of the functions that you do. So I'm not entirely sure that our workforce shortage problem isn't also, it's definitely, let's say, on the supply side, but on the demand side, let's say, we really need to become more efficient in the way that we are doing the work of cybersecurity. If you took all of the hours that are wasted on clunky processes and turned that into, an analysis of how much work actually needs to be done, I think we would be surprised what the actual workforce shortage looks like.
And it's this idea of something that is very boring, actually. It's like, it's resemblance to this thing Heli said, which is make security like just checking boxes, which is not very agile or interesting at all. It's like companies have to check boxes. They're not thinking about if that's necessary, and it's the same with the people who access the security things in the company. Are there questions in the audience regarding cyber resilience or the workforce or anything else? Yeah, there. Where the microphone is coming.
I would like to know where Google is doing the routine work. Where are the labors? I heard some rumors that in Kenya, they are employing, not Google, but other companies are employing cheap labor to do this, boring work.
What was the first part of the question?
You mean the security work, the security teams are located somewhere else to do the boring work? So really the way to think about, working in a security operations center, and so at Mandiant, for example, we have 4 of them around the world. And what they're tasked with doing, and very intentionally in places scattered across time zones so that you can have a 24/7 watch. So there is definitely benefit in having these security operations centers deployed around the world. But the problem becomes the thousands and thousands of alerts that pour into these systems and the demands on people to actually triage and prioritize. So one of the let's say the things to combat that is if you have robust threat intelligence. So if you know which alerts are most important, you can prioritize those first, and then and then look at it that way. But if there are one of the main reasons why you have security operations centers deployed around the world is to have 24/7, to have a segmented approach, and to have backup locations so that if something were to go down, you could pick up a hot site somewhere else for resilience. Here's another question.
Thank you, Wolfgang Kleinwächter. On the international level, we have now 2 UN bodies dealing with this issue. On the cybersecurity question, it's the open-ended working group in the UN. And then we have negotiations on a cybercrime convention in Vienna and in New York. My question goes directly to Sandra. What the private sector expects from these international negotiations, will there be any useful outcome which will help you to identify both the criminals and the bad state actors?
Well, that is the hope. As we continue to work together with governments and public-private partnerships, the hope is that we can continue the evolution to break down the walls of sharing threat information and making this something that we can tackle together. But some of the things that become very, let's say, sensitive in organizations and in negotiations that way is, everybody that comes to the table has a cyber capability, right? And what are we going to agree on in terms of norms? What are we going to agree on in terms of non-negotiables? And I think that is obviously the hope and concern that we will be able to solve that.
So how is it going so far with, the open-ended working group, for example? How do we establish cyber norms when there are obviously state actors that aren't like that eager to?
Well, I change hat back to the government now and say we already have cyber norms. We shouldn't say that we should establish them. Diplomats have been working for 10 years, including German government and the Estonian government and the US government, to establish this, what we call the framework of state, responsible state behavior. So we have cyber norms, we have international law, we have confidence building measures. So these are pretty set good principles that countries need to follow. I don't think we need new norms or new laws right now. We need to just implement the existing ones. And this is the question of enforcement and following the norms and laws. IHL applies, or international humanitarian law applies. So we know what to do in conflict, but Russia does not observe international humanitarian law even in physical space, so not to talk about cyberspace. I think it boils down to this responsibility as an international actor. And the question in the UN is not so much what comes out of those 2 groups right now. I think, if I may say so now, with my academic freedom role, what we, the Western governments, are doing, we are in damage control mode in the United Nations currently, in cyber. We do not need new norms and laws. So under the first committee, what we need to do is to make sure that the open-ended working group will socialize the existing norms and international law amongst the developing nations so that everybody will follow those. And under the third committee, when the cybercrime treaty is being negotiated, we have to make sure that the cybercrime treaty does not become the global treaty that allows the censorship regimes to basically conduct mass surveillance over their citizens. And this is the real threat there. So damage control mode in the United Nations. This was said with academic freedom.
Yeah, yeah. However, you want to...
Well, actually, that's the field of my colleague, Regine Greenberger. But as Heli already said, there's not a lack of rules and norms, but a lack of implementation. And this is the big challenge.
For all of you who don't know Regine Greenberger, maybe that's a little bit too nerdy again, it's the German cyber ambassador. She's responsible for representing Germany at those institutions. Sorry, I just need to add that. Before I close this panel in 4 minutes, I get this funny cards all the time. I want to ask, we talk a lot about Russia, actually. This panel was about the war, and of course it is, but I think yesterday it was Stormy, she did the poll, and the one thing that was the main challenge was the top vote, how to deal with China. So maybe some closing remarks on how did China change its strategy in the last year under maybe the radar with the ongoing discussion about the Russian war. Sandra, what do you see in Mandiant's intelligence?
From our perspective, one thing that China has not demonstrated that Russia and Iran have demonstrated, for example, is the deployment of a lot of destructive and disruptive attacks. It's not necessarily the Chinese cyber execution strategy. What we have seen, though, is a lot of espionage, and then in recent years, a lot of influence operations. What started out as, it's a group that is tracked under the name Dragon Bridge, it's the campaign's name, but it started out just trying to discredit Hong Kong protesters. Well, now the content continues to flow out in a matter of, over 10 different languages, in 30 different, social media platforms. It's platform agnostic at this stage, and it is a constant flow of misinformation or disinformation. So the question then becomes, what is the strategy of the Chinese? We don't know. We don't have a direct attribution to the Chinese government right now for Dragon Bridge, but it is closely aligned with PRC objectives. So.
Do we forget this actor?
Well, I can't forget China, of course, as a cyber expert. What we have seen, I think, is that China certainly is also in this kind of observation mode. China has not conducted destructive operations so much, but more the APTs for intellectual property theft and the other. It has other motivations with cyber operations. And what we, the Western community of academics and governments, of course, should do is to bring China into this kind of responsible state behavior narrative, because I think we need at least China to be responsible, since we know that Russia, of course, we cannot expect Russia to be responsible in any time soon.
So when we're talking about cyber, it's also always very dark, I guess, and we want to have something hopeful now. And the last thing I want to ask you three is something that gives you hope regarding cyberspace. Maybe a motto or something that keeps you going. Sandra.
I'm happy to start because I only ever get to say what's going wrong. When you meet the cyber worker force, and you see young people who are committed to the mission, who are learning new skills, who are excited about, defending the internet, the rule of order, that is very inspiring to me. That there is an entire workforce that is so dedicated to the mission. So let's make it not so hard for them. Let's invest in them.
Well, what encourages me is that cyber has come out of that nerdy corner, but it's a very public discussion right now, and it's more a public concern, an open discussion, and we raised awareness a lot. So I think this is the very first step to reach our aim that cybersecurity is everybody's topic.
Heli, last words.
I would also maybe echo what Barbara just said. We are now at the stage with our cyber awareness where all the famous think tanks in Germany or foundations like Aspen or Bertelsmann are organizing at least one cyber panel, not the whole conference on technology and conferences and panels on these issues, which I think is also the mainstreaming of the cyber to a more strategic framework. And it's good, but it's also, I think, something what we have to be mindful of not overgeneralizing the issues, but still have the discussions which are kind of point on the topics we need to discuss. So
thank you. So I hope we did this on-point discussion for you, and thank you so much for giving us your insights and expertise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.